A long time ago, an old Chinese farmer named Yu Gong decided to move two inconveniently located mountains so they wouldn't block the entrance to his house. Legend says that he worked really hard and in the end succeeded. This is where the Chinese idiom Yu Gong moves the mountains comes from, meaning something like, where there's a will, there's a way. But now this legend is becoming a reality because China is literally tearing down mountains. And they're doing it pretty actively. In the mid-2010s, an army of 6,000 workers and more than 3,000 excavators and dump trucks was unleashed on hundreds of mountain peaks with one goal: to flatten them. One by one, the mountains were moved in pieces into the beds of trucks and hauled away, and the landscape changed almost before your eyes. But why? A little coffee and we'll get started. Just an unobtrusive reminder to do something under the video in case you forget to do it. So, we have 700 mountains that China plans to tear down. It's important to note that these aren't just 700 mountains in one spot, they're scattered all across the country, and they'll be torn down as part of one project, where it's necessary. First of all, in Lansao, as part of a project called the biggest mountain moving project in China's history, one of the country's largest construction companies is leveling the land in Lansao to give developers the chance to build a new megacity. The first phase of the mountain leveling initiative started back in late October 2012 and is ultimately expected to provide nearly 10 square miles of usable space. As I mentioned, this effort is led by one of the country's largest private companies, China Pacific Construction Group from Nanjing. And if it works out, China will have a flat plain here, and they'll be able to do pretty much anything they wish. Why? Well, Lansao, the capital of Gansu province in western China with a population of 3.6 million people, used to be a major trading city on the ancient Silk Road. Now there's a big push to revive the city's historical importance because Lansao is really well located, right at the geographical and cultural crossroads between the heart of China and Central Asia. The second part of the project is focused on Yan'an, in Shaanxi province, and is supposed to double the current area of the city, creating 30 square miles of flat land. The works began in April 2012. And of course, there are other projects leveling the land around Chongqing, Xi'an, and Yichang. And all of them are part of Beijing's efforts to develop China's western regions and ensure the flow of millions of people from rural areas to cities. It makes perfect sense. If you build a city, people will have somewhere to go. But a city needs space. So let's tear down the mountain. By the way, where does all the rubble go after the demolition process? The stuff that used to be the mountain. At first I thought they might take it somewhere far away and dump it there. Something like a huge landfill, but just for mountains. But that sounds like a completely pointless thing to do. Think about it. If you move the material from one mountain to another place, the mountain will just appear in a new spot. But now it won't be a solid natural formation anymore, just a pile of loose rocks. Seems pretty unsafe. But China came up with a trick. They fill the valleys, the natural low spots, with all the debris. This way they kill two birds with one stone. They get new land where the mountain was, and then get extra land from the filled-in lowlands. This is especially useful because lowlands are often unsuitable for construction or farming, as they're prone to flooding and landslides. But if you fill them in, that's a different story. And now let's get back to Lansao. After all the stages are done, this area got the most open space, a whopping 96 square miles. That's a massive empty space. They must have some specific plan for it, right? Of course, it's called Lansao New Area. An ad posted on the website of the new district in Lansao shows a digital cityscape with shiny skyscrapers and green parks. Accompanied by opera music, the camera pulls away from a large government building to reveal the features of the imagined city layout: a clock tower, a new airport, an oil refinery, a light rail system, and a stadium packed with cheering fans. These were the promising plans of Chinese developers. It's been a few years since the mountains were torn down here, and now the area looks, well, livable. Real. On both sides of the road, there are rows of nearly identical 30-story high-rises neatly placed on their respective 1,600 by 1,600-foot plots. Dozens of these complexes are lined up, totaling hundreds of towers and tens of thousands of new apartments. Lansao New Area was originally a fully planned neighborhood, and it shows. It's a giant grid designed by urban planners. This is what the new district looked like from the air in 2016, but of course it's expanded since then. Remember I mentioned its strategic location? Well, thanks to that, Lansao is once again being used as the gateway to the West and is preparing to become a major hub of the Silk Road economic belt. The Silk Road economic belt is the land-based half of China's One Belt, One Road initiative, which will help create a massive network of new highways, rail lines, logistics and industrial zones, pipelines, power plants, seaports, administrative centers, and new cities stretching from East Asia to Western Europe. Yep, that's how grand it is. Of course, it's still a long way to go before the new Silk Road is complete, but the Lansao Free Trade Park has already been created. This huge logistics zone, almost 1.2 square miles in size, was carved out of Los Hills. The main part of the park is a comprehensive bonded area which performs its primary function, customs clearance for trucks and trains shipping goods out of the country. Since one of the main goals of the new Silk Road is to make transportation across borders cheaper and more efficient, a network of customs zones has been set up all over China. But there are even bigger ambitions. This zone is meant to become a hub for electronics production, high-tech equipment, biomedicine, and on top of that, a center for cross-border e-commerce. It sounds like in no time it could become the center of the whole world. Another large project is Silk Road Cultural Heritage Expo City, which will focus on organizing public exhibitions and developing tourism. The project's initial cost was estimated at a huge amount, ranging from $500 million to $750 million US. The project started in October 2015. Musicians, dancers, and government officials took to the construction site and performed on the newly leveled land. As part of this project, led by Great Wall Television, one of China's largest media agencies, plans are in place to build a film studio, an animation center, and a tourist park. In the new district of Lansao, they also plan to build a lot of other new Silk Road projects, including the Ice Water World Park and a dinosaur park. And yes, to make these projects happen, China is tearing down mountains. Honestly, I think the word grand doesn't quite capture the scale. However, all these projects face some criticism. 3 Chinese scientists back in 2014 claimed that the plan had not been sufficiently considered environmentally, technically, or economically. There was too little modeling of the costs and benefits of land development. Instead, they jumped straight into the work, and as a result, inexperience and technical issues are delaying construction and driving up costs, while the environmental impact is hardly being considered at all. And honestly, this isn't anything new. A lot of land reclamation projects in China skip over environmental rules because local authorities tend to care more about making money than protecting nature. A simple example? In April 2013, work at one site was stopped for an environmental review. 4 weeks later, construction resumed because of mounting costs to the local government and contractors, and this happened even though the review wasn't finished yet. And that was a mistake. Creating land by chopping off mountains or hilltops and moving huge amounts of soil is like major surgery. Only instead of a living body, it's the Earth's crust. Mountain peaks have been moved before, especially in the eastern US, but nothing on this scale has ever been done. In China, for hundreds of miles, they're leveling dozens of hills 300 to 500 feet high to build cities, which has never been done before. That's why there are no guidelines for creating plots of land and challenging mountain conditions, and those are not easy conditions. So it's no surprise that the project has already run into problems and unpleasant consequences due to rash decisions. It's Lansao again, and cutting down the mountains unexpectedly caused some air problems. Well, not so unexpectedly. At some point, the work was temporarily stopped because of the pollution level caused by dust. You know why? No one thought to wet the soil to keep it from flying everywhere. Originally, Lansao had a population of 3.6 million people, and even before all these mountain projects, it already had serious environmental issues. In 2011, the World Health Organization named it the city with the worst air pollution in China. This is not surprising since the city's main industries include textiles, fertilizer production, and metallurgy. None of that really sounds like good for the environment. Other experts have also pointed out the financial risk of building a new city, basically in the middle of a desert. The investments are supposed to pay off through income from residential land, but in such cities, the returns are usually pretty low. By the way, in November 1997, the British channel Sky News visited Lansao and reported on identical plans to move hills, fill in valleys, and level the ground for construction. The scale was smaller, but the idea was exactly the same. Back then, it was claimed that tearing down the mountains would improve the environment because it would allow the eastern wind to blow across the recently leveled land and the mountains wouldn't get in the way. The Daxingshan project was specifically aimed at removing a peak that was 5,540 feet high, towering over the city. The idea was to create a little extra land that could be sold to developers. The public was told it was all about improving the city's air quality. Without the mountain, they claimed, the wind would blow the smog away, quote, like opening a window to let in the breeze. They managed to remove half of the mountain before the project was shut down, but it didn't affect the air quality at all. The city was the most polluted in China in 1997, and it still is. All right, we've covered Lansao. What's going on with the other parts of the project? This is Xi'an. And here, cutting down the mountains led to some totally unexpected consequences: landslides, flooding, and water contamination. Well, maybe the consequences would have been expected if they'd asked the ecologists, but the thing is, soil erosion increases the amount of sediment in local water sources. In Xi'an, Hubei province, the removal of mountains caused landslides and changed the course of rivers. This had serious consequences for the city. Since it's not far from the starting point of the South-North Water Transfer Project. In other words, they wanted to send water from here to Beijing, but this water ended up being polluted. If you're curious about how erosion and mountain destruction are connected, it's pretty simple. All the plants are removed from the slopes before they start cutting down the mountain. This increases the risk of soil erosion and groundwater loss because plants block the wind and hold moisture and soil particles in place. Without plants, the soil breaks down faster, and then a heavy rain comes, and that's it. Landslides and floods happen. Here's Yan'an, where construction had to be completely halted despite huge amounts of money being spent. Why? Because they used soft silt deposits to create new districts of the city. That's very, very soft soil. This soil easily sinks when the humidity increases, causing buildings to collapse. This means that the $16 billion project can't move forward until the ground becomes more stable. Unfortunately, China only realized this after the digging had already started, because all these projects are carried out with almost no scientific assessments. In 2014, halting the excavations at Yan'an cost 500,000 yuan, or $68,000 per day in payments to idle workers. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any information on how things are now, but if you know, feel free to share in the comments. Anyway, China keeps tearing down the mountains because it believes the projects will pay off in the end. Local authorities expect that the mountain demolition will bring billions of yuan from selling or renting the new land and saving agricultural land in other parts of the country. In other words, they won't have to give up land for construction elsewhere, and instead they'll be able to grow something there. For example, Lansao New Area could boost the region's GDP to nearly $34 billion by 2030. It's already attracted almost $9 billion in corporate investments. Well, the idea that land development always brings economic benefits can be challenged by cost modeling. For example, the total cost of the Yan'an plan at $16 billion won't pay off for decades because construction can't begin for at least 10 years while the soil stabilizes. Such a long payback period scares investors away from buying land, and the economic risks grow significantly. But maybe the real reason for tearing down the mountains isn't the desire to make a profit. China's simply running out of resources in the form of available land for construction, and this is how the country solves the problem. Cities in China are growing rapidly as the economy expands. However, there's a catastrophic shortage of land for this growth, especially in mountainous regions where about 1/5 of the population lives. Over the last decade, local authorities have started tearing down mountain peaks to fill the valleys and create land for construction, as this seems like the most affordable option. Well, of course, you can't ignore the financial gain. Urban land for development is one of the most valuable assets in modern China, and the construction of new cities, districts, high-tech zones, logistics centers, and infrastructure is what drives the economy in all regions of the country. And when it became clear that some mountains were standing in the way of these important projects for China, preventing them from unlocking their economic potential, the answer was obvious. The mountains needed to go, but this all needs to be done wisely. Experts believe that all the problems can actually be solved if there's an exchange of experience and technical strategies on the national and international level. Cooperation between universities, research institutes, private companies, construction crews, and governments is necessary. This way, China will get the results of the best research and ensure that huge amounts of government money are invested wisely. Without cooperation, land development campaigns could drain the local and national economies and cause irreversible damage to water flows and ecosystems. Unfortunately, the situation is the opposite for now. There are studies, but they're local and focused on monitoring and modeling soil deformation, subsidence, hydrogeological changes, and protecting surrounding slopes. Economic and environmental risks are not considered. The number and scope of research groups are insufficient, and the limited experience and skills of local scientists only make the situation worse. Institutes are having trouble collaborating. Each one manages its own sub-project and rarely shares research data with others. Teams have to repeat work to get data that another institute already has, wasting time and money. Also, no international organizations or scientists with a lot of experience in this area are involved in tearing down Chinese mountains. Those who were involved in removing mountaintops in the United States should be invited to take part in Chinese projects, but let's just say the relations between the countries have been especially tense lately. The most important news in the past few days is that my hyperextension machine has started to help me. If you have a desk job, don't forget to keep your back muscles toned and, of course, stretch regularly. Fake nature. Numerous tourists have long been impressed by the views from the summit of First Peak of Pengcheng on Wutong Mountain, which offers a panoramic view of the southern Chinese city of Shenzhen. While there are plenty of mountains in China with scenic vistas, this peak is quite different from the rest. The thing is, it's fake. This was discovered by two tourists who ignored the warning signs when the peak was closed for maintenance. The Wutong Mountain Administration didn't deny it and confirmed that this peak is actually a structure made of reinforced concrete and steel built in 2004 to mimic natural rock. So for many years, people were just being deceived? Well, not exactly. It's just that no one really asked about the origin of the boulder. It was simply a great spot for photos and everyone was happy. But this isn't the only natural site that turned out to be fake. On Yuntai Mountain in China, there's a beautiful waterfall, 1,000 feet high, which is also a popular tourist attraction. And yes, the discovery was again made by one of the tourists. He noticed a pipe from which water flows to create the waterfall. The tourist posted his investigation on the Chinese social media platform Weibo, and the video gathered 14 million views. After which the authorities got involved and started their own investigation. What do the park representatives where the waterfall is located say about it? It turns out they had a reason to add a pipe into the mountain. The representative said that the waterfall is a natural landscape feature, but it's seasonal, so to prevent tourists from leaving disappointed, they made a small improvement. In other words, during the dry season, the waterfall needs some extra help, or else only a thin, unclear stream would flow down the mountain. Local authorities have asked the park management to openly share information about such improvements in the future and warn visitors in advance. However, it's unclear if they actually tell tourists about it. Hidden car park. In general, you get the idea that China really knows how to reshape the landscape. But the country doesn't just create new natural features, it also hides urban infrastructure inside them. Take a look here. These are the twin hills standing at 121 and 157 feet tall, made possible by a $313 million investment. After 7 years of construction, they finally opened, providing both locals and visitors to China with a place to relax while hiding all the unsightly stuff inside. In addition to winding trails, waterfalls, and thousands of trees, there's also space for 1,500 cars. To create the parking lot, 6,000 piles were driven into the ground, and over 30,000 tons of steel and concrete were poured to form a reliable structure that could hold a lot of cars. However, there was one problem. The project was started in a seismic zone, meaning there's always a risk of landslides. To address this, massive concrete retaining walls crossed the slopes of the mountain, each filled with soil and planted with trees and shrubs. Local officials, by the way, had mixed reactions to the artificial mountains. Some called the project a ridiculous waste of money, which also leaves a huge carbon footprint. Others made fun of the mountain's tiny height. But whatever the case, the project ended up being unique and has become a landmark for many tourists in Shanghai. Mountain escalators. Not all the mountains in China are as low as the ones I just mentioned. Some rise hundreds or even thousands of feet. so climbing them can be quite challenging at times. However, tour operators in China came up with something interesting. To make the mountain landscapes more accessible to everyone, escalators were installed on the slopes. For example, you can see an escalator on Tianyu Mountain in Zhejiang Province, which was installed there in 2022. Now, the exhausting hour-long climb is turned into a comfortable 10-minute trip. Plus, the ascent to the mountain is smooth, and then there's only a 1.8-mile walk left to the summit. Many praise this initiative for the opportunity to enjoy the beauty of nature without limitations, especially for the elderly and children, for whom climbing can be difficult. But not everyone agrees with such changes. Some critics oppose the installation of escalators on mountain trails, arguing that it makes the ascent too easy and ruins the spirit of mountaineering. In their view, mechanical lifts rob tourists of the joy of conquering the peaks on their own and diminish this sense of achievement. Although I doubt anyone would turn down the help of an escalator when they're too exhausted to keep climbing. Not enough space. Now let's go back to what I was talking about earlier. China doesn't have enough space for infrastructure and its population, so the country is leveling mountains and building new structures. But this isn't the only way out. You can also live right on top of mountains. For example, the people of the Chinese village of Guoliang have been living over 5,500 feet above sea level for more than 6 centuries. Their houses are perched on the edge of a sheer cliff, which could only be accessed before by climbing 720 steps carved into the rock. It's dangerous, and they had to find a way to connect with the rest of the world, so the villagers came up with a solution. They dug a tunnel through the rock. It's interesting that the tunnel was built using only manual labor. The tunnel reaches a length of over 0.75 miles, a height of 16.4 feet, a width of 13 feet, and was constructed by a group of just 13 people in the 1960s. The villagers spent 5 years digging the tunnel, making life easier not only for themselves, but also for future generations. The village head was in charge of the construction and decided to sell goats and medicinal herbs to buy hammers and steel tools with the proceeds. In the end, after the construction, during which more than 12 tons of drill rods and 4,000 hammers were used up, the tunnel was open for traffic in 1972. Until recently, the world actually didn't know about the village of Guoliang, hidden in the Taihang Mountains. It used to be a secluded spot where farmers had lived for 6 centuries. But after the tunnel was discovered, the village became famous and now attracts tourists from all over the world. You owe me a like. See you later.